To understand what really unfolded in Davos over the last 48 hours, you need to picture the setting first. The Swiss Alps, January 21, 2026. The World Economic Forum, global leaders, one stage, and on that same stage, less than 24 hours, two speeches were delivered, and they couldn't have sent more different signals. One speech steadied the room, offering clarity, confidence, and a long-term vision. The other slowly came apart, as its speakers struggled to step away from a crisis he helped create. Because despite what today's headlines are saying, the deals, the frameworks, the claimed victories, that's not where the real story is. The real story is how Canada's Prime Minister walked onto that stage on Tuesday and delivered a speech many now call a turning point for the West, and how, less than 24 hours later, Donald Trump returned to the same podium and showed something we almost never see from him. Backing down, that's when Mark Carney steps onto the Davos stage. If Carney isn't a name you follow closely, here's why the room instantly changed when he began to speak. This isn't a career politician testing slogans. This is someone who has sat at the very center of global finance. Former Governor of the Bank of Canada, former Governor of the Bank of England. Still the only individual in history to have held both roles. That matters. Because when Mark Carney talks about financial stability, capital flows, or economic leverage, he's not speculating. He's describing systems he once helped run. And the people listening aren't casual observers either. They're managing pension funds, sovereign wealth portfolios, and balance sheets larger than most national economies. So when Carney began, the room leaned in. But here's what made the moment different. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't point fingers. And he didn't frame the world in terms of winners and losers. Instead, Carney talked about credibility. He spoke about how economic power in 2026 no longer comes from pressure, but from predictability. About how global markets react not to threats, but to signals. And about how alliances quietly weaken when economic decisions are treated as zero-sum games. Without naming any country, he described a world where smaller nations are forced to hedge. Not because they want to, but because they no longer trust the intentions of the largest players. That line landed because everyone in that room understood what he was really talking about. Carney then shifted to the Arctic, not as a battleground, but as a stress test, a region where strategic competition, environmental responsibility, and economic restraint intersect. And he warned, calmly, that miscalculations there wouldn't just reshape geopolitics. They would rattle markets, shipping routes, insurance premiums, long-term investment confidence. This wasn't rhetoric, it was risk analysis. And as Carney wrapped up, he left the audience with a quiet challenge. Leadership in this decade wouldn't be measured by dominance, but by restraint. Not by how much pressure a nation could apply, but by how much stability it could provide. There was no applause cue, no headline-ready quote, just a pause, and in Davos, that pause spoke louder than applause ever could. What followed Mark Carney's speech wasn't immediate applause or dramatic headlines. It was something far more important. Movement. Inside Davos, conversations shifted almost instantly. Not on camera, but in private lounges, side corridors, and closed-door meetings where the real decisions are shaped. Delegates who had arrived, prepared to discuss Greenland as a strategic opportunity, began reframing it as a liability. And that distinction mattered. European officials started asking different questions. Not how do we secure access, but who absorbs the risk. Nordic representatives grew cautious. Insurance executives quietly recalculated exposure. Shipping analysts flagged uncertainty premiums. Carney hadn't forced anyone's hand. He had changed the cost-benefit equation. Within hours, international media picked up the shift in tone. Early coverage focused on Carney's credibility, rather than his politics. Former central banker, crisis-tested, calm under pressure, the kind of leader markets listen to, even when voters aren't watching. And that's when the contrast began to sharpen. Because while Carney was shaping the narrative inside Davos, the Trump camp was scrambling outside of it. By Tuesday evening, aides were pushing talking points emphasizing progress and framework agreements. Friendly outlets were briefed about strength and leverage. The goal was clear: Project Momentum before Trump took the stage the following day. But there was a problem. The room Trump was walking into had already moved on. By Wednesday morning, January 21st, Trump's speech was no longer anticipated as a moment of dominance. It was being watched as a test. Would he escalate? Would he double down? Or would he adjust to the new tone that had settled over Davos? Expectations matter. And in this case, they were no longer aligned with Trump's usual playbook. When Trump finally stepped onto the stage, the setting was identical. Same hall, same audience, same cameras, but the atmosphere was noticeably different. Where Carney had spoken into calm, Trump spoke into caution. He opened with confidence, framing Greenland as part of a broader strategic vision. He referenced negotiations, progress, mutual benefit. But as the speech unfolded, something became clear to those listening closely. The language had softened. Gone were the sharp edges, the ultimatums, the familiar pressure tactics. In their place were qualifiers, vague timelines, carefully worded assurances. This wasn't retreat in name, but it was retreat in substance. Trump was trying to hold ground that had already shifted beneath him. Markets noticed, diplomats noticed, and most importantly, allies noticed. Because in global politics, what you don't say can matter more than what you do. And Trump didn't repeat the threats that once defined his approach to Greenland. He didn't escalate. He didn't confront. He recalibrated. By the time the speech ended, headlines were already forming. Some framed it as a deal, others as a compromise. But beneath the surface, a quieter assessment was spreading through Davos. This wasn't a victory. It was damage control. And the reason wasn't pressure from rivals. It was the absence of support. In less than 24 hours, Mark Carney had shifted the center of gravity, not through confrontation, but through credibility. Not by opposing Trump directly, but by making his approach harder to sustain. The stage was set, and the real consequences were just beginning. By the time Davos wrapped up, the public story was already being simplified. Headlines talked about progress, about dialogue, about supposed wins and carefully worded compromises. But the real story wasn't in what was announced. It was in what quietly changed afterward. Within days, financial analysts began revising their outlooks. Not dramatically, not publicly, but enough to signal caution. Arctic-related investments were reevaluated. Long-term infrastructure projections were adjusted. Insurance firms widened their risk bands. This wasn't panic. It was hesitation. And in global markets, hesitation can be more damaging than open conflict. Greenland, once framed as a strategic asset, now carried uncertainty. And uncertainty doesn't attract capital, it repels it. That was the unintended consequence of months of aggressive positioning, followed by a sudden recalibration. Investors noticed the shift immediately. They saw a U.S. administration that had talked up leverage only to soften when credibility was questioned. And they saw a Canadian Prime Minister who never claimed control, yet emerged as the stabilizing force in the room. That contrast mattered far beyond Davos. European leaders began coordinating more closely with Ottawa. Quiet phone calls replaced public statements. Policy alignment strengthened in areas that had little to do with Greenland on the surface: trade rules, climate financing, Arctic governance. This wasn't about choosing sides. It was about choosing predictability, because predictability is the currency of modern power. And Trump's speech, for all its polish, introduced doubt instead of clarity, not because it was weak, but because it was reactive. It followed the narrative instead of setting it. Media outlets focused heavily on the optics. Who looked confident? Who dominated the stage? But those watching markets paid attention to something else entirely: signals. Carney had sent a signal of restraint and coordination. Trump sent a signal of adjustment. And when those two signals collide, capital always follows the former. Behind the scenes, U.S. allies began hedging, not abandoning Washington, but preparing alternatives, diversifying supply routes, expanding diplomatic channels, reducing dependence on unilateral decisions. This wasn't rebellion. It was risk management. And it highlighted a deeper issue. Trump's approach had always relied on momentum, on forcing others to respond. But Carney disrupted that dynamic by refusing to react emotionally, by reframing the conversation in economic terms that couldn't be brushed aside. And once that frame was set, Trump's options narrowed. By the end of the week, the Greenland issue had effectively cooled, not resolved, but contained. The urgency had vanished, the leverage had faded, and in its place was a slow, bureaucratic process driven by committees, reviews, and long timelines. That's the opposite of how Trump operates, which is why the real outcome of Davos wasn't a deal or a declaration, that it was a delay. And in geopolitics, delays often favor those who thrive in systems, not those who try to bend them. As analysts began connecting the dots, a quiet realization spread. This wasn't just about Greenland. It was about who shapes the rules when power is contested. And for the first time in years, the answer didn't point to Washington alone. What made Davos truly significant wasn't any official statement or closing communiqué. It was the absence of one clear authority setting the direction. For decades, moments like this would have ended with Washington defining the narrative, allies adjusting, accordingly, markets following, and institutions aligning behind a single center of gravity. That didn't happen here. Instead, something quieter took place. Power dispersed. Not dramatically, not symbolically, but structurally. Middle powers began acting less like supporting characters and more like system managers. Countries that once waited for cues were now coordinating among themselves, sharing intelligence, aligning positions, and quietly building redundancy into their alliances. Mark Carney's speech didn't cause that shift. It revealed it, because the conditions were already there. Global trade has fragmented, supply chains have regionalized, financial flows have become more cautious and more selective. The idea that one country can dictate terms without consequences has been eroding for years. Greenland simply exposed the fault lines Trump's strategy relied on. Pressure creating compliance, but pressure only works when resistance is fragmented. When resistance becomes coordinated, pressure loses its edge. That's the lesson many leaders took from Davos. France didn't respond alone. Germany didn't hedge quietly. Denmark wasn't isolated. The response was collective, measured, and legally grounded. And that's why it worked. Carney understood this dynamic deeply. His background in central banking taught him that stability isn't about force, it's about confidence. You don't threaten markets into trusting you, you reassure them. That philosophy translated cleanly into geopolitics. Instead of escalating rhetoric, Carney lowered the temperature. Instead of issuing ultimatums, he framed choices. Instead of demanding loyalty, he invited cooperation, and paradoxically, that made his position stronger. Trump, by contrast, was forced into adjustment, not because he lacked power, but because power without consensus is expensive to use. Every escalation increased the cost, politically, economically, diplomatically. And once those costs outweighed the benefits, the strategy stalled. This moment marked something subtle but important. The redefinition of leadership. Leadership was no longer about who could dominate the room. It was about who could hold it together. Markets responded accordingly. Institutions followed the path of least volatility. And volatility wasn't coming from Ottawa. It was coming from unpredictability. That's why the Davos contrast mattered so much. Not because Trump lost face, but because Carney gained credibility. Credibility compounds. It shapes expectations. It anchors negotiations. It reduces friction. And in a world moving away from rigid hierarchies, credibility becomes more valuable than raw power. This doesn't mean the U.S. is weakened beyond repair, but it does mean the margin for unilateral action has narrowed. The room for improvisation has shrunk. Future demands will be tested. Future threats will be measured. And future responses will likely be collective. That's the new terrain. Greenland was the trigger, but the shift runs far deeper. What emerged from Davos wasn't a new order written on paper. It was a new behavior practiced in real time. And once behavior changes, structures follow. History rarely announces itself in real time. Most turning points don't arrive with treaties or declarations. They show up as moments of contrast, where the paths are revealed side by side. And the world quietly chooses which one feels safer to follow. That's what Davos was. Trump arrived believing leverage would once again do the work. For him, the threat of tariffs, the suggestion of force, the expectation that pressure would fracture alliances. Instead, it produced the opposite effect. It hardened coordination. By the time Trump spoke, the space for escalation had already closed, not because anyone confronted him directly, but because the costs of escalation had become visible. And when costs become visible, power behaves differently. Carney understood this instinctively. He never framed the moment as a confrontation with the United States. He framed it as a test of systems, of whether mid-sized economies could protect themselves without triggering chaos, of whether cooperation could replace coercion without appearing weak. That framing mattered, because it gave other leaders permission to act without overreacting. It transformed resistance into responsibility, and it allowed alliances to assert boundaries without provoking collapse. Trump's retreat wasn't theatrical, it was procedural. The language softened, the timelines stretched, ownership claims turned into frameworks, military options quietly disappeared. That wasn't defeat, but it wasn't dominance either. It was adjustment, and adjustments, when repeated, become precedent. From this point forward, every major demand issued unilaterally will be measured against what happened at Davos. Allies will ask, can we coordinate? Can we absorb the pressure? Can we slow this down? Because slowing things down proved effective. The Greenland crisis didn't end with a winner. It ended with a realization. Power is no longer just about who pushes hardest. It's about who can endure pressure without fracturing. That realization has consequences. In Europe, it reinforces strategic autonomy. In Asia, it strengthens multilateral hedging. In markets, it rewards stability over spectacle. And in Washington, it creates a dilemma. A system built on leverage struggles in a world optimized for coordination. Threats lose value when targets are prepared, and unpredictability stops being intimidating when it becomes expected. That doesn't mean Trump's approach disappears, but it does mean its effectiveness is capped. Carney didn't outshine Trump by overpowering him. He outpaced him by operating within institutions rather than outside them, by lowering volatility instead of amplifying it, by making patience look like strength. That's why Davos will be remembered, not for the Greenland headlines, not for the frameworks or the walkbacks, but for the moment when the world saw two leadership models tested under the same conditions and quietly adjusted its expectations. The old order may be fading, but what replaces it won't be chaos. It will be slower, more networked, more resistant to pressure. And in that world, those who understand systems will shape outcomes, while those who rely on force will find fewer places left to push. That's the real lesson of Davos, and that's why this moment matters far beyond Greenland.